Welcome, everybody, to the 17th episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we're talking to Morgan Artyukhina, who is a journalist with Sputnik and has written extensively about policing in the United States. They did a three-part series with Sputnik, which we'll link to in the show notes. And we're going to talk about a lot of what's contained in that series today and the increased militarization of policing in the United States and a lot more that goes along with that. So, Morgan, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, okay, the articles are great. We are kind of like history nerds. We like to know, how we got where we are today. And that's kind of what the articles do. It kind of takes a deep dive into, the circumstances that led us to the situation where, the Ohio State University campus police have an MRAP, when you started, doing the work into the history, how far back did you go? Like where did you start from?
Well, I mean, I don't really talk about it in the piece, because there's a lot of background research that you do and stuff. You may not be surprised to learn that I was actually trained as a historian and not as a journalist. But a lot of the same tools apply and methods apply. So, really the thing you have to understand is really the origins of the police first, right? I don't talk about that in my piece. The piece is focused specifically on how did they become militarized in the way that they are, and really what are the origins of a couple of key themes that I pull out from that. But there are other things that I don't really talk about too, which is the origins of the police force in the U.S. as one, a tool for slave catching patrols for apprehending runaway slaves and returning them to their masters, and two, as a tool for busting up labor unions and workers' movements in cities like New York, which was the original purpose of the LAPD. So when you understand the twofold nature of the origins of the modern police force as such, then that's really what kind of all the subsequent understanding flows from. But as far as the themes that I really touch on in the story itself, it really kind of goes back to the 1960s and the wave of Black mass uprisings in Watts, in Detroit, in Newark, in Washington, D.C., in so many other cities around the country that really kind of put the fear of God, or the fear of revolution, I should say, into a lot of police forces, such that they were really able to capitalize on a lot of the white fear and ruling class fear that created, to turn themselves into a real paramilitary force. And there's other.
Do you think that you started kind of from the 60s? We look around us, and today it's it's an obvious attack on Black human beings out there in the world by a occupying police force, and it's become this really tense and dramatic situation. And I think that that's something a lot of people don't realize, that this goes as far back as the slave the slave patrols, and where they're bringing people back. And I'm kind of rambling, sorry. But yeah, was that just kind of the connection that you were trying to make, just given to the current events that we find ourselves in?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting serendipity, but I think the reason that it's on everybody's minds now, which is why it was topical for me to write this piece, although people have been talking about this for years, as you know, but I think the reason that it's really become something that's awakened in the popular consciousness now, the reason that they are willing to pull out all the stops, is the same reason that that drove this militarization in the first place, which was the last really big nationwide round of Black uprisings. I mean, there have been many since then. Los Angeles in 1992, Ferguson, Baltimore, which are really kind of, if you want to think about it, really all of those are kind of prefigurations of this present explosion, in that they are driven by, in different ways, reactions to a really kind of aggressive, militarized, paramilitarized policing in the U.S. of Black and brown communities. So it's not a coincidence that that's what we are going back to look at, and that, or that it's on full display now and isn't on display, in any of the other protest movements or whatever. I mean, if people remember back as far as 2000 in Seattle in the World Trade Organization, you kind of you can see it there too, but it's I think there are different contradictions that are coming to the fore now that really make it kind of imperative that the ruling class show that they're willing to use extraordinary force to maintain authority. The anarchist protests outside of the World Trade Organization, what was it, the G20, I think, meeting, might have been the G8, I don't remember, were not a threat to the system itself. They were a threat to a particular part of Seattle and all of that, but what we see now is nationwide, and you can hear it in the way that Trump and other people, Senator Cotton speak. It's just a brazen display of force. They want you to know, they want us to know that they're capable of this and a whole lot more.
Right, absolutely. And just to touch on one more historical point, I'd like to bring up the Bobbies, which Sir Robert Peel started in England to initially repress and suppress revolt in Northern Ireland. So violence is built into the DNA of policing, whether you look at it on that side of the Atlantic or this side of the Atlantic. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that I was going to keep it U.S., but we can absolutely talk about Sir Robert Peel and the Peelies or the Bobbies, depending on which side of the Irish Sea you want to talk about, being the same kind of thing. That's really kind of Sir Robert Peel's entire career, isn't it? From when he was Home Secretary, through Catholic emancipation, really up to the destruction of the Tories, in an effort to usher in, some really aggressive capitalist free trade measures that the aristocracy was against. So he's really that. Yes, that's a whole different well to go down. But
I think it's also important too, though, as we said, taking a historical look at it, I think it is important to take a global look at it too, because it's not like this is, as Jesse and I were talking about, before we called you, we were talking about how we use our military to police the world, and it's no wonder that will manifest itself back at home. That's absolutely what's going to happen. That's just common sense. But I think it is a global thing. We see our police force now being trained by the IDF, and it is a global thing. And I think it needs to be thought of as such, as important as it is to know the history from all, the United States and from the UK and all of those things. It's also important to recognize that this really is a global thing, and it's something that needs to be looked at as such, because if we're not seeing that, I think we're going to miss a lot of things that, could be detrimental,
Yeah, well, I think this kind of overt, I don't want to say over policing, because I don't know what an appropriate amount of policing is, but right, you know what I mean? But I think that under capitalism, there is a very different demands placed on systems that maintain order, which are the police, but also the army, the justice system, and I would argue even the education system too. There is so much effort that goes into making sure that people stay in line. And when you think about ideology and education and kind of propaganda, a lot of the purpose of that is to save police the trouble of keeping you in line, so that you'll know your place, you'll know what happens when you step out of line, and you won't do it, right? The threat of violence is itself a form of violence. So that's really what's behind that. But it's also that there is this great expansion of policing with the advent of the capitalist system, as you said, Jesse, in Britain, where it happened first, and then there was this explosion in the United States. You can see a similar thing happening in France, for example, after the French Revolution, especially after the Restoration, and especially with like Haussmannization under Napoleon III and the kind of forced industrialization that they go through. You can see it in Russia in the early 20th century, in the final decades of the Tsarist monarchy. There's the same kind of explosion of whether it's the secret police in the form of the Okhrana, or a form of more like kind of hussarized, gendarmerie. There's the cat.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? It brings with it a whole new type of policing that accompanies a whole new type of kind of a codified code of laws that gets that was then imposed on a lot of the world by European empires and such. It's not just the Napoleonic Code; it's also the English Common Law Code, which still serves as the basis of the law codes in more than like 4 dozen countries around the planet that were once colonies. So there's a whole different kind of demands that are placed on that. And I think that's why you can point to Peel, you can point to the NYPD, you can point to a bunch of these kind of similar origin points around the world for this dynamic where you see this transformation of kind of the town watch into the full-time, labor busters that we see today.
Right. And to bring it up to speed a little bit, we talked about the riots and uprisings in the 60s. My father lived in Newark at that time, and he remembers seeing police firing tracer bullets up through tenement buildings. You could see the bullets going up through the floors. These were obviously dilapidated buildings. So even at that point, you had police using tracer bullets, which aren't the most sophisticated form of weaponry, obviously, but they were already using non-standard munitions, I guess you could say, non-standard weaponry at that point. But then something called 1033 came into place. Can you talk about what 1033 is?
Yeah. Well, so actually, there's one more thing that I wanted to mention, because you brought up Northern Ireland and policing there, is that one of the most notorious crowd control weapons now, the rubber bullet, the so-called baton round, was developed by the Royal Ulster Constabulary in 1970. It was the same thing. They said, oh, you're supposed to shoot it at people's feet. It's supposed to hit their like shins or whatever. And like immediately, first 10 years, they were like, we have to stop using this. It's knocking out hundreds of people's eyes and stuff. Mm-hmm. Same shit that's happening now. And then they were like, whatever, we don't actually care, because the Troubles were in by then, and there was an actual urban guerrilla warfare going on in Northern Ireland at the time. So yeah, I mean that right there parallel continues right up to the present day too.
Yeah,
but as far as sorry,
we've seen a lot of Gilets jaunes protesters losing their eyes from getting hit with those rubber bullets.
Yeah,
I think a journalist lost an eye in Indiana. A journalist, just recently. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, what's interesting in the Gilets jaunes protests too is that, in particular, it's hand grenades, a type of like crowd control grenade that is literally just it's an actual like explosive. And when those protests started, they were using them, and we know about this because there was a whistleblower who came out from the French Federal Police who said, like this is what's happened inside, which is basically that they found that this weapon was like extremely dangerous to people, and said, we have to stop using this or whatever. And I think that the Justice Ministry said that, and then the police force responded. They said, actually, we're just going to use up our entire stock of these first. And so that's why people have been losing eyes, but also hands. Lots of people have been losing hands in the French protests. And it's the same thing. It's because the police are literally throwing hand grenades into crowds. So yeah, it's disgusting.
So it's been more so hand grenades with the Gilets jaunes as opposed to rubber bullets.
I can't speak to the volume of rubber bullets they're using or other similar rounds, but I do know that the hand grenades are a big thing because of this, especially because of this whistleblower.
Okay.
I just saw something similar to that at a protest in the US. I can't remember where. I just saw it in passing on Twitter. But I think that there was I don't know if it was firecrackers or something was being thrown at the front line. I'll have to look it up. I'll have to double check myself, but I'm almost positive I saw that just happened actually like last night maybe. But I'll look it up to be sure. But that just made me think of it. But yeah, I mean, it's become common practice. I mean, look at what they did to Standing Rock. I mean, sweet Jesus, they had water cannons out there in freezing temperatures. United States citizens. You guys, that's not great. Is that the world you really want to live in? Like, there should not be that kind of power imbalance ever between a police force and the citizenry. That's insanity.
Yeah. Which is actually a good segue into 1033, which is what you wanted me to talk about 5 minutes ago. Yes, we'll get there. So 1033 is something that came about in 1997, 96 really, but it was the 1997 National Defense Authorization Act, which is the bill that funds the Pentagon. And what it did was it added to the law code a new law that allowed the Secretary of Defense to pass to law enforcement that requested surplus military equipment. And it really they created the Law Enforcement Support Office, which is a part of the Defense Logistics Agency, to facilitate that process. And that's really what really opened the floodgates to a lot of this military hardware entering the hands of police forces. It built on an earlier similar law, which was passed in 1990, which I think was called 1208, that was specifically aimed at like certain small arms that would have to be used for like given to like anti-drug units and stuff. So it was specifically with the mind of like the war on drugs, but it kind of built on that same kind of paranoia, which going back to the 60s, this idea that like first it was like, well, the Black Panthers outgunned the police, then it was, you know, the drug lords outgunned the police, and then in a couple of years after the 1033 program, it's, you know, the bank robbers are outgunning the police in the North Hollywood shootout, and so on. So there's always this kind of like, we're being outgunned, you know, we can't hack it on the streets. We need bigger guns. We need better guns. We need armor, you know, protection and whatever. Because that's the thing, is that you'll see a lot of reporting about the 1033 program and like them getting these weapons and stuff. But what they don't talk about is that it's the police forces that are driving this dynamic. The Pentagon doesn't go to them and say, do you guys want this stuff? They ask for it. Mm-hmm. So they think that they need MRAPs and M16s and 50 caliber sniper rifles to do their jobs, and grenade launchers to do their jobs. And that's where the real problem is, because that gets into the psychology of policing in the United States, and the paranoia and the fear and the siege mentality that they generate, that is only exacerbated by, like we were talking about before the show started, about, you know, them training with Israeli police who are in an occupation situation where they treat every single person that they're policing on the street as a potential terrorist. Mm-hmm. So they bring that attitude back here, and they bring it back from Iraq, you know, where 20% of all police officers are veterans. And they do that on purpose. They try to recruit from the military because these people already know how to use weapons. If they've served in Iraq or Afghanistan, they already know how to engage in crowd control tactics and such. You know, so U.S. police during the Iraq War were not only training with U.S. troops who were in Iraq, they were also training with the militarized anti-terrorist brigades that were formed at the core of the new Iraqi military that was set up, that was going into and fighting in Fallujah and Ramadi and all these cities alongside U.S. troops. U.S. troops were in a lot of those operations, if you look up what they're talking about at the time, in support of Iraqi police operations. And it was these militarized, kind of like Vortex style, again, paramilitary, like they were called police because the U.S. disbanded the entire Iraqi police force, the entire Iraqi military, which created a lot of the problem they faced there in the first place. So the U.S. police are going to train with those units too, who the entire history they have of policing is, you know, crowd control, fighting, you know, crowds that are fighting back. So they bring those attitudes, you know, with them. back
and
to
I
the
think
United.
that's really important to talk about too, because I don't think people, and maybe it snuck up on a lot of people, but I think anybody who observes how the United States uses its military to police the globe, I think should have been ready for that to manifest itself back here. I think that that's a natural progress, and I think that anybody who didn't see that coming, and I'm sure it snuck up on a lot of people. I think a lot of people still aren't aware, but I think really prior to Ferguson, I don't think a lot of people recognized how fast it was approaching. I think Ferguson woke a lot of people up to, I think that was the first time that, they had this shit out on the streets and people were like, wait a minute, where'd you get that? Like, why
Yeah.
do you have that? I mean, I went to a college football game. That's why I said something about Ohio State having an MRAP, because I went to a college football game, and I'm walking around on the streets outside the shoe, and there's an Ohio State University camouflage MRAP, and I'm like, do they need that at a college football game? Like, I know Ohio State fans are a little crazy, but this is ridiculous, and I think that really did wake a lot of people up, that whole time frame. But yeah, I mean, and it kind of just also speaks to like how and the SWAT team was kind of bolstered by all of this too. I watched a documentary where they said that, I think it was like, there were police departments who were only using them like once a month or something in the 80s. And then those same departments then jumped to something like, I think they said like 80 a year. I have it somewhere, but yeah, by 1995. And that was like, a lot of that was like no-knock warrants. And that's, Breonna Taylor, and was it Louisville, right? I mean, this is all stuff that's been compounded by the 1033 that you were talking about, and this access to these weapons and these tactics and this mentality, this war mentality. I mean, our police force walks around acting like they're at war with the people. That's not how it's supposed to be. That was not the point. The cops and the military are supposed to be separate. Like, they're not supposed to have the same tactics and the same weaponry and all of that. It's a ridiculous, just confusion of how those two things are supposed to operate. Do you think that it also was exacerbated, at least the number of departments that were getting weapons and the kind of weapons that they were getting after we pulled out of Iraq in, what was it, 2011, I think? Because there was kind of a surplus then, a whole bunch of shit that they didn't need and were looking to get rid of. And, it seems like a lot of police departments started eating a lot of their stuff up now. Right.
Yeah, well,
right.
I mean, the end of the Iraq War, right? The end of the Iraq War, also in scare quotes there, because we know that that's still happening. We're still in Iraq against the wishes of the Iraqi people, as we saw in January. Did create a big surplus of items. But like I said, the issue was not so much the surplus as it was that police forces wanted this stuff. And what's interesting is, I mean, yes, there was more surplus for them to ask for, but a lot of it is also bought new, which is what I talk about an ACLU report from 2015 in the story that found that a good percentage of these items are not used items, they're new items, because there is nothing stopping the Defense Department from just buying the things that the police request and then giving it to them for free. So it's like, and at that point, you're just getting around budgets like that. You're just lying about your budget at that point, So it's like when your mom, won't give if she gives you money for gas and you take that money for gas and go use it to buy beer, she really just bought you beer, didn't she? It's the same kind of thing. Like, if the Pentagon is spending its money to buy new items for police forces, you're just giving that money to the police forces to buy these items. Like, it's the same thing. And so yeah, I mean, the Iraq War did that. The Iraq War also pioneered the use of some of these weapons, such as LRAD, the sound cannons, for example. The LRAD sound cannons were developed after Al Qaeda blew up the USS Cole, and they were originally supposed to be mounted on the sides of ships as a deterrent for like boats that got too close or whatever, pirates or
that was in Aden, Yemen in 2000, correct?
Yeah, it was in the port of Aden, and yeah, they blew a hole in the side of the ship with like a dinghy that was loaded with explosives. So that was originally the purpose of the LRAD. And then just 4 years later, not only were they using it in in Iraq, rather, as part of these crowd control operations, like I said, the NYPD already had one themselves, and I have a picture of one from a protest in 2004, mounted on top of a police van there. So that's a weapon that made the leap from one to the other very, very easily. And then now every police force has one. They didn't turn it on, but I had one pointed at me at a protest, a couple of months ago. So they have it out there, and I know what it looked like. So I was like, that's not fun. It was mounted on top of a Bearcat, by the way. So, which again, another armored vehicle, that was created to really get around the shortcomings of the Humvee, which cannot survive an IED at all.
And that's an Bearcat.
Bearcat, yes, it is. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it is. I think it's actually in the story, but I don't remember what Bearcat stands. But it is an acronym for it's like an armored all-terrain. I don't know.
Can I just stop for a second and just take, I don't know, maybe a philosophical point of view? I don't even know. As a smart, whatever, as a rational thinking human being, grown up adult, the fact that we're talking about these kinds of things being driven through our streets and used on our citizens, and what the fuck is wrong with people? Why is this okay? I don't understand. Jesse and I have talked about this before, though. To think that the people in charge, the grown-ups in charge, the way that they like to solve problems is to blow shit up and create as much chaos as possible. That's terrifying. I can't imagine what kind of person you have to be to want to drive an MRAP down your street and point guns at your citizens, your neighbors, your fucking neighbors. This is your working class neighborhood people, and it just blows my mind. We talk about this all the time, and just trying to rationalize that way of thinking in my brain doesn't work. It's just exhausting. So ridiculous.
Well, I think it has to do with, and Morgan, perhaps you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but it has to do with both the projection of power or the projection of violence, I should say, and the use of that violence. And we were talking about the warrior mentality earlier. So when you get to the academy now, you're a warrior. You're trained to see each person you come in contact with as a potential enemy, a potential threat. And some people just become cops because it's their only job option. But as Alex Vitale, whom I interviewed several months ago and who wrote a great book called The End of Policing, has pointed out that the fact that the policing system in the United States and all around the world essentially is corrupt means that anybody who joins that system is going to be corrupted, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're Hispanic, Asian, what have you. The system is inherently corrupt, and that's going to corrupt you in some way. And that's why you have a lot of seemingly rational people doing horrendous things as police officers. Would you agree with that, Morgan?
Yeah, I think there are probably people who join the police force with maybe good intentions about making your community safer or something like that, because they really only think within the system, that exists, and within the kind of logic that underpins the system. The police are supposed to keep us safe or whatever, is kind of what we're taught. But I think really kind of gets to the core of what Misty was talking about in terms of how can some people justify this or whatever. And a lot of it is fear. White people are some of the most heavily propagandized people in the world because they are taught to hate people of their own class, people of anybody who doesn't look like them. They're, really have to be heavily convinced of this, of their separateness from other people who are actually like them, in order to maintain this system. They're kind of used as the frontier the frontier guard, to keep a lot of the working class in check. So a lot of that is fear. And like I said, it goes back further than the 60s, but the black uprisings in the 60s, which were some of the first articulations of the Black Power movement, Watts came after the Civil Rights Act, after the Voting Rights Act, and it kind of shocked people in a lot of ways because they thought like, oh, a lot of this turmoil is going away, but actually it entered a whole new phase where it was becoming a more distinctly class-based struggle. And what's interesting is that you can also see a transformation in Dr. King's thinking at that time, where he begins to, his final campaigns in the last years of his life were, the war on poverty in Chicago and in the North, and where it was a very different ballgame. But it also increasingly becomes a criticism of the Vietnam War. And he talks about the bombs that are dropped abroad explode at home. Which is not just money wasted, but it's also the inculcation of a militarized, violent attitude where if you oppose America and Americanness and whatever, then you're a communist who needs to have, bombs dropped on you or whatever. So that's the thing too at the time of that was that the U.S. was occupying half of Vietnam and bombing all of Vietnam and several of the surrounding countries. And at that time, police officers were drawing the same comparisons too. After Watts, Police Chief William Parker was, saying that, he characterized it as urban guerrilla warfare. He referred to them as like, the Black Panthers and such as like the Viet Cong in our society. They were conscious of these comparisons. And then on the other side of the coin, is Huey Newton talking about how the police are an occupying army, an occupying force, and them drawing direct comparisons between them and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, whom they actually volunteered to send Panthers to go fight alongside. So there was, both sides of this issue are drawing these same parallel lines of comparison at the same time. And I don't think that that's an accident either. Even 20 years later, when you have the kind of hyper policing in LA that came about in the years before the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics and then never went away afterwards, that really kind of built up the pressure cooker that then exploded in 1992. A big part of that was Operation Hammer, which was these mass sweeps of certain districts in Los Angeles where they would just close off the district and then sweep through. And if there was like 3 or more non-white guys standing on a street corner together, they arrested you for suspected gang activity. And, most of those people were not charged with anything, but they were in the system at that point. And, they were blowing up neighborhoods. They were blowing up houses. They were storming through entire neighborhoods, ransacking like whole apartment blocks. Like they were out of control. And it was a decade of that, and in that time too, you have the same comparisons where they're talking about like, this is Vietnam is what a member of the head of of their narcotics unit says in 1989, so like that memory of like, this is an urban guerrilla war is still there, and they think about it. And what's interesting, this is where being a historian comes into play. Reading about that, there's a really great account of that whole dynamic in Mike Davis's book, City of Courts. And reading that reminded me of when I read about the anti-colonial war in Kenya in the 60s, the so-called Kenyan emergency or the Mau Mau uprising. The British Army did in certain sections of Nairobi when they were chasing down Kikuyu militants the same thing that the LAPD did in Compton, the exact same thing. They did, and so it's like here's a colonial war abroad, here's a colonial war at home, and it's the same practice, the same dynamic, the same mindset, and the people doing it are conscious of that fact.
And you mentioned the LA riots in '92, and a lot of people still have the misconception that the genesis of those riots was unilaterally the police beating of and almost murder of Rodney King. But as you mentioned, there were at least 10 years before that of what sounds like brutal repression. And still to this day, though, people think that the LA riots began with the Rodney King beating and Black people in LA just lost their shit, and the background gets completely whitewashed out. And it reminds me of another long forgotten incident, which is what happened to the Move compound in Philadelphia in the 1980s, when the Philadelphia police essentially dropped a bomb from a helicopter on a house that had children in it and killed several of the Move members, including children. Can you talk?
That's crazy that can happen, and people just like
hang on.
It's not even taught.
You guys are both speaking at the same time.
Sorry.
Can you talk about that incident a little bit? Because I feel as though it's more seminal in what we're seeing with regard to militarized police now than people know, especially because a lot of people don't know it happened or don't remember that it happened.
About the Move bombing?
Yeah.
I'm not the expert on it that I should be, but well, not really. I mean, I'm familiar with it. I'm familiar with the dynamic behind it, and I've read the interviews like with Ramona Africa and folks, but I don't know that I could really give you the kind of comparison that you're looking for.
Okay.
I just think that it's crazy that can happen, and it's not like there was just like a big thing on Twitter recently, maybe a month or two ago, where people were talking about how they never learned about it in school, and it was like, did you learn about this in school? And there was a whole thread of people who were like, this is the first time I'm hearing about it, people in their 30s or whatever. And I think that it's crazy that kind of thing can happen in this country, and it's not taught in schools, and that's a pretty significant piece of our history as a country, that something like that could happen in the freest country in the world. So I think that's just like a huge condemnation of our education system. And the fact that I just remember being really sad about that, because I don't think I learned about it in school. I don't remember. I was not in school a lot. It was kind of, but I don't remember learning about it in school, but I do. I would say I was probably like 22 or something before I really knew what it was, I would think. And so I think that's a common thing, and it's horrible.
Well, I mean, when do we ever learn about the crimes of empire? Well, we learn about the nuclear bombs, at the end of World War II. But even those are kind of taught to us in the context of like, well, we had to do it or whatever, because they were never going to surrender and whatever. But how many people in school learned about the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed more people than both nuclear bombings combined? How many people learned about the Iraq War and all that? How many people learned about the complete annihilation of the city of Fallujah? How many people know that in Afghanistan, we hear about, like 4,000 Americans or whatever have been killed or whatever. We don't talk about the fact that total results of, increased morbidity as a result of people killed in the war, disruptions of supplies, of medicine and all of that stuff. Some 400,000 Afghans are dead since 2001 because of that. We don't talk about that. So, I mean, the fact that we don't know about the Move bombing, or we don't know, who the Move 9 were, or about, any of this stuff. I mean, why would we? I mean, that's the ugly side of empire. Unless they can rationalize it and weave it into their narrative of how America is great, then they're not going to tell us about it. We learn about 58,000 American soldiers killed in Vietnam. We don't learn about 2.5 million Vietnamese who were killed. We don't learn about how Laos is the most bombed country on the planet. We don't learn about the 15-year-long secret war in Laos, or how the U.S. bombed Pyongyang so much that there was not a single 2-story building left in the entire city. But we learn about, we watch MASH or whatever, So that's, we learn, if you're lucky, you might learn about Frozen Chosin. That's it. We just don't talk about the ugly side of those conflicts.
Well, and I think that goes back to you saying that white people are the most propagandized people on planet Earth. I think the United States is definitely the most propagandized country on Earth. And
right. Well, I mean, I think the thing is that, it's not that nobody knew about the MOVE bombing. It's that nobody who was in a position to talk about it for a mass audience knew about it, right? The Black community has been terrorized, for 400 years by these kinds of tactics. It's not news to them. It's old news to them. So it's not that things are unknown. It's just that things are not talked about by people who want to talk about them. And I mean, that really gets into a different question of like, not just who's writing the textbooks, but who controls the media, and even then it's not just the race perspective, it's also a class perspective. Because, the U.S. military has been unleashed against white protesters too. We could talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the U.S. Army Air Corps bombing, striking West Virginia coal miners. We can talk about Pinkertons, Ludlow. So many, there's so many examples that you can use just the same. But you don't learn about those either. So it's, I mean, there is the correlation between, there being a white ruling, a white supremacist ruling class, but it's also, the fact that that the media is, the mainstream media is by and large a subservient to the ruling class, or populated by members of that ruling class, or funded by that ruling class, so they can't say what they want to say, because of who owns them or who funds them through advertising, so there's a whole kind of way that the media is constrained from talking about things that maybe reporters might want to talk about, but don't for various reasons.
I agree.
But how does it frustrate you as a historian? I mean, because it frustrates me as just somebody who likes to learn about history and who likes to find the, the connections, because everything, I mean, if you look back at history, you can usually kind of see where things are headed. I mean, humans are stupid and we make the same mistakes over and over again. But I love learning about history. And so that as a historian, just the complete miseducation of an entire country about their actual history has to be really frustrating to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is. And I mean, my specialization in history is actually the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So, I mean, talk about an example of, where history is written by not just the victors, but by the people who have the books, who have the printing presses. So that's, there is a great deal of that. The Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm writes in one of his really great books called On History, which is a book about the historical discipline. For historians, he talks about how one of the most important duties of a historian is to know what really happened so that they can't lie to us. They can't manipulate the past. They can't take these events and these narratives and spin them to suit their own purposes. And so a lot of our job as historians is really kind of maintaining a memory, a collective memory of like what really happened in this situation, what the deal really was. And I mean, if you look at today, look at the way that, George W. Bush is being reimagined as this like resistance hero, or to say nothing of Reagan, and the way that Reagan has become a bipartisan hero, or any number of examples that you could pick.
John McCain.
Yeah, John McCain, absolutely. I mean, shit, Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I mean, look at his record and his career.
How long until Trump is rehabilitated, guys? Do you guys want to bet? How long it will take for Trump? How long do you think it'll take for Trump to be rehabilitated? We should bet. I give him 7 years. 7 years, and he'll be on Dancing on Ellen, and she'll ruffle his hair.
I'll give him till the election after this one, which I guess 4 years or maybe 8 years. The next time there's a Republican who comes up, we'll talk about that. Republican will be so much worse than any Republican we've ever seen in history. And yeah, people will fondly remember Trump.
Yeah.
So I don't know. or it could be even Biden. Biden can get in and just have some world-class dementia, and then people will be like, at least Trump could form coherent sentences. Like if they'll do it, they'll find a way, because that's what happens, right? You have warmongers, you have genocidaires, you have slave masters, you have every kind of war criminal you can imagine. In our catalog of presidents who have now been reimagined as great heroes, and had their crimes and their controversies erased. Name a president, and we can talk about that. So yeah, I mean, I think it is ultimately only a matter of time, assuming, of course, the optimistic projection that the United States will exist in 4 or 8 years. So, because that's not a certain thing anymore.
Right.
They say that we only have 10 years left before the climate change causes irreversible damage. So, I mean, tell me how a country is supposed to survive that when it is dependent on, on global exploitation. So I don't know. I don't really want to put money on it, but I mean, it is definitely a long-standing dynamic of reimagining the past to suit whatever presence I mean, imagine 10 years ago, 12 years ago, who could have imagined that George W. Bush would be giving hugs to Ellen and showing off his weird ass paintings and like fondly remembered as like this like benign person. He was Satan incarnate in 2004, 5, 6. Like it's people were arguing about like, the 30%
like
who
pining for the days.
And like that was the argument in the mid 2000s, was like, how are people so stupid that they will never, you know what I mean? Like that was, and now we're on Trump, and Trump's supposedly worse, and maybe he is, maybe he's I mean, maybe Bush would have been the same way if he was in the situation that Trump is in now. I mean, part of it is also that Trump is a person who is responding to a situation that the U.S. ruling class finds itself in right now, which is an extraordinary situation abroad, where you have U.S. hegemonies being challenged in many areas, and then at home, where even its capacity to maintain order is falling apart. Any president, Hillary Clinton, if she had been elected, would be doing this basically the same thing that Trump is right now. And that's a hard truth for a lot of liberals to think about. But this is the woman who boasted, we came, we saw, he died, unleashed a brutal civil war on Libya that, led to the creation of new slave markets, led to the proliferation of the terrorism that they said that we were fighting across another half of another continent. So this is, she said she wants to start a war with Iran, so this is, I mean, we could talk about her own kind of law and order record too. So, if she had won, she would be doing the same thing.
I think all that changes is the packaging. Trump is the packaging. This is the same. It's the deep state agenda. I mean, people laugh at the term deep state, but whatever you want to call the people in charge, because it's not Donald Trump. And if you think it is, you're kind of dumb, because it's not Donald Trump. He's not running anything. He is the packaging. Hillary Clinton would have been the packaging. That's all it is. It's continuity. Obama continued George W. Bush's bullshit. You know what I mean? It's the same stuff. It's just a different package. Barack Obama managed to, be charming and charismatic and engaging, and he was able to sell it to you a little easier. Donald Trump rips the mask off and just straight up tells you, yeah, we're going to go steal their oil. I mean, that he just says the quiet part loud, what like everybody says, that's Donald Trump. And that's the only reason that whoever they may be, that they don't like him,
Right.
That's the only thing
He's
that they don't enjoy about Donald Trump. Yes. And he can't shut up. He has no gift for subtlety. He just blurts shit out. He likes to appear strong and powerful. And so he'll say shit that he shouldn't say out loud, but he's just such a buffoon. He doesn't know how to not say it. And so I think that that's the only problem that he poses for the people in charge of everything, because he has not done anything that Obama wouldn't have done. He has not done anything that Hillary Clinton wouldn't have done. It's the same shit. It's just with a loud mouth carnival barker at the helm. That's all it is. And people aren't willing to accept that fact, but that's a fact. If you look at the policies and the direction that things have, all Trump has done is take what Obama did and move it a little bit forward. And all Obama did was take what W did and move it a little bit forward. I mean, it's the same shit. It's the same steady march to the right for a long time. I think that you're right. That's a very unfortunate fact that people.
I do think an important dynamic, though, is if you look at Clinton, as in William Jefferson, Bush Jr., and Obama, that axis, if you will, for the national security state, those were the golden years. Those presidents were totally fine upholding the status quo of the national security state and the military industrial complex. Barack Obama had at least 3 American citizens drone assassinated extrajudicially. So
his only problem was that tan suit.
Trump comes into office, and immediately the Russiagate nonsense starts, and he's at loggerheads with the deep state or the NatSec state, whatever you want to call them. And even though he makes use of them sometimes, they still see him as a huge threat to the status quo they enjoyed for 3 different presidents. That's how it seems to me, even though a lot of the arguments, the so-called resistance, which is essentially undergirded by the national security state, will make, are completely false or not based in reality, as in Trump has been easy on Russia, and they don't detail any of the increased sanctions he's put on Russia whatsoever, or the military assistance he sent to Ukraine, which ends up in the hands of neo-Nazis. So I think that's an important component too. It's definitely his personality and the fact that he will say whatever comes into his mind at any given moment. But I do think he represents a substantial threat to this NatSec status quo. And that's why you have people like John Brennan freaking the fuck out, and everybody else in that retinue.
I mean, I think the thing is that I think okay, let me talk about what both of you guys just said. I think that Misty is right and you said this too, Jesse, about drawing continuity, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and then between Trump and Bush, Bush and Clinton, Clinton and Bush, Bush and Reagan, Reagan and Carter, just kind of keep going back, understanding that flowing thing, because it wasn't, a totally new thing. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that Russiagate got its, wind in its sails when Trump won, but Russiagate was really begun before Trump was even declared to be the nominee. When you look at the Pentagon's national security strategy, when you look at a lot of the things that they were talking about that shifted this hostility toward Russia in terms of U.S. policy, what they point to, they don't point to the election and supposed interference or whatever. They point to Ukraine. They point to the fact that that the Ukraine color revolution, the 2014 one, not the 2006 one, the 2013 one that Yanukovych was somebody who was kind of not really playing ball with the way that the U.S. had tried to get things going there since 2006, but also that their coup against him did in the Euromaidan movement did not really it had an unexpected side effect, which was causing large parts of Ukraine to rebel, and that included Crimea joining Russia, and the Donbass, the Donetsk River Basin rebelling. But there was rebellion, I remember, in 2014 too, and a lot of other places in Ukraine as well, and this is actually something that just happened now, where they are removing Russian as a national language in education and a lot of government things and stuff there. They tried to do that within 2 weeks of the coup. The new coup government tried to do that within 2 weeks, and that's what sparked the Crimea breaking away. That's what sparked the revolution in the revolt in the Donbass. And when that happened, there was actually a protest by Ukrainians all across Ukraine where they spoke Russian for a day in protest to this attempt to remove Russian as a national language. So there was actually a lot of resistance all across the country. In Odessa, for example, where the trade union building was burned by these neo-Nazis and all of that. And it just happened that by the summer and fall, the only places that it had really sustained itself was in Crimea, which broke away, and then these other areas where there was an armed uprising, where there was already a lot of anger from a working class that had been thoroughly forgotten about for 20 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That's where the iron industry is. That's where the coal industry is. Going all the way back to the 1930s with Stalin's industrialization was when that area, the Donetsk Basin, the Donetsk coal fields, got their main focus in what at the time was Soviet industry. The dissolution of the Soviet Union destroyed all of that. It was all sold off to Western banks, to Western firms that then just destroyed all of those industries because then there was just cheap competition. And so that's really the core of that, and so it did their attempt to push NATO up to the east, up to the border of Russia on that front did not work, and so that's really what they point to when they talk about like the Russian revisionism, quote unquote. They call Russia a malign actor, I think is the term they use, or whatever. So that's all during Obama, and so the Russiagate was just the next articulation of that. I don't like the term deep state. I just talk about the capitalist state and its attempt to maintain the status quo, which is the capitalist class rule, independent of the specific chief executive that manages the capitalist state for them. And so when I see the intelligence apparatus and certain sections of it, fighting against Trump, who has his own support in other areas, I see two factions of a single ruling class duking it out for the best way to manage these contradictions that the U.S. is facing that we've already been talking about. And part of that is a debate over it's not even a debate over revanchism with Russia, hostility against Russia and China. It's really a debate about focus, about should it be Russia or should it be China? Because each side, Trump says China is the one who's rigging the election. The Democrats say it's Russia who's rigging the election. So it's really kind of a duel between which one is the one that we should demonize, more. And that's really what I think is at a lot of the core of that, because they really agreed, like you said, fundamentally the Trump administration has attacked Russia thoroughly in many ways, with CATSA, with economic sanctions, with upholding these kind of ridiculous narratives about the Skripals and now Navalny and so much more. So it's that's how I understand this situation that we're in, and that's what enables me to think about these things in terms of continuity, and to see that whether Trump wins a second term or Biden wins, these trends are going to stay the same.
I kind of have a theory that it's not really even about. I think that they have, what was it? Oh, why am I blanking on his name? General Wesley Clark. The 7 countries that he listed. I think if they have, a list of countries that they'd like to go fuck with, and I think that it's honestly which one can they sell to the people at this time. And so they're going to throw out some Russia stuff. They'll throw out some China stuff. They tried to throw out some Venezuela stuff. They've tried to throw out some Iran stuff. And whichever one they can kind of finesse the propaganda enough to make it acceptable to the public, or at least passable, I think that's what they go with. I honestly think that there's no like, this is just me speculating, but I think that they have, an end game, and it doesn't really matter how they get there, and whichever one they can, muscle up enough support for, that's what they go with.
Well,
So
I think the end game is, as Noam Chomsky has said often, strategic or control of strategic resources. That's the end game. And the patina they put over that is, well, this is a hostile entity. Maduro is a hostile entity. So he's not towing the United States' line and is therefore dangerous to the United States, and he must be deposed. But you look underneath that, Venezuela's oil resources are humongous, and its control of those strategic resources, which I think undergirds these forever wars that the United States has entered into and is still trying to enter into.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's more to it than that, but I think that the control over resources is two-pronged. One is that the U.S. wants it, and the other is that the U.S. wants to deny it to other people. And sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they're slightly different. You can control a country and not tap its oil resources, but at the same time, you're denying that access to other people. But yeah, I mean, with Venezuela, absolutely, Venezuela has enormous oil reserves, and it's a 2-day steam, from Maracaibo to Houston. That's an easy trip, as opposed to the trip from the Middle East. But also, I think that there's also, like Misty said, like there's, they have their list of their countries that are a challenge to U.S. rule somewhere. Either they have resources, they just want the U.S. plan in some way. Either they have resources, or they provide aid to other movements, or they pose the danger of a good example. I think when you look at Cuba, when you look at Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, before Lenin Moreno came to power, Bolivia, you're looking at countries that are not just because they're socialist or socialist leaning or whatever, or have oil resources or lithium or whatever. It's also that they are setting an example of an alternate path of development, of an alternate path of economic organization, right? Those countries, a lot of those countries in Latin America, I mean, of course, Hugo Chavez, was they attempted to throw him over as early as 2002, which actually wound up It happened less than a year after the revolution really began to accelerate, after the writing of the new constitution and the implementation of new programs that explicitly identified like women's oppression as a site of struggle, that whole situation between the coup and then his reinstatement and then the oil lockout over the winter really actually kind of hardened and caused the revolution to accelerate in a major way. But there is that danger of what really happened is that those nations began to form Mercosur. They began to form their own market that no longer centered the United States. Which is a big deal because these are countries that for hundreds of years, their entire existence has been geared around extraction, and we can talk about that with Evo Morales in Bolivia too, about him for years prioritizing Bolivians first, trying to bring not just extraction industries into Bolivia, but also processing industries. It wasn't just that the U.S. wanted lithium resources. It was that the U.S. wanted control over value-added lithium production of batteries, which is what Evo Morales was negotiating to bring into Bolivia. So it wasn't just raw lithium being exported to be built into a battery for Tesla somewhere else. It was he wanted to build the batteries themselves in Bolivia, So that's kind of a game changer in terms of like countries taking control over their own wealth and using it as they please, rather than existing as basically a glorified plantation for a country that they are only nominally independent of. But the danger of a good example is really powerful. I mean, you take another example of a country that was overthrown, Grenada, the New Jewel movement there in 1984. Maurice Bishop spoke English. They speak English in Grenada. He came to New York City and was able to talk to people in the Bronx in plain English. That's extremely dangerous. Walter Rodney in Jamaica was able to come here and talk to people in English. And that's, and you could have this direct thing, Audre Lorde goes to Grenada right before the invasion. It was possible to have this direct exchange without having to go through a translator or something like that. And so that's a really big danger to the U.S., because then you can have oppressed people in the U.S. talking to these people, getting ideas from them, realizing that you can challenge these things, getting ideas and whatever. So I think that's also part of it. But in terms of like for example, like Libya, a country that's been on the U.S.'s radar since at least the early 80s, mm-hmm. if not earlier. He's been a enemy of the West, since, he overthrew the Italian installed dictator when he came to power. That was a military coup, is how he came to power. Gaddafi did. But why did Gaddafi have to? Why in 2011? Well, it's because of the African Development Bank. Libya financed the bulk of the African Development Bank, which, like Mercosur, was a alternative to the IMF, an alternative to the World Bank, that was able to provide a development financing options for African countries that were not predatory, that were not based in Brussels or Washington, D.C., and funneling these wealth out of the continent. And so it was Libya and Algeria, which still has the legacy of its revolutionary government there, that financed the African Development Bank. The headquarters of AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, are in Stuttgart, Germany. I don't think people realize that. You know why they're there? Because every country the U.S. went to in Africa to try and put the AFRICOM headquarters there, Gaddafi went to each of those countries and offered them twice as much money not to build the headquarters there. Mm. So this was a man who was frustrating every effort of the U.S. to get its foothold in this continent and to try and build this continent up in a way that it would be able to look to itself for development and fund its own development in a Pan-African way, rather than looking to, like I said, these kind of age-old models of Western extraction.
Little-known fact about Gaddafi is that he was the first Arab leader to report Osama bin Laden to Interpol, I believe, in 1998.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm not trying to fet him or laud him at all, but there's a lot. People have this stereotypical picture of Gaddafi as the increasing plastic surgery and eccentricity. And yes, there was that. And he was not a good man, but there were also things he was trying to do to secularize the Arab world, the North African Arab world, at least, or region, you could say. And as you said, Morgan, he posed many threats to what the West wanted to see done with Libya and North Africa, and I think the African continent in general. So
I kind of hate that you need a qualifier like that. Like, you have to talk about this guy and then be like, yeah, I know he was kind of a dick, but he did some cool stuff. Name me a single world leader who is a decent guy. There isn't any. They're all psychopaths. Let's be honest.
I know.
I know what you're saying. I'm just saying that, like, it's like when you talk about Putin, if you say anything good about Putin or something that he does, you then also have to say, like, I know he's really, kind of a dick. And no, it's okay. You can just say that, Gaddafi was, kind of a dick, but he also did some cool stuff. That's fine. Just the qualifier stuff just always bothers me. I think that all of these guys, we've been fed a line of shit. We don't really know. I mean, like, the normal, some of us may know, but like an average American, they only know what they're told on Fox News and MSNBC. That's the only story they have of a Gaddafi or a Putin or a whoever. Mm-hmm. So it just goes back to that whole complete lack of education and how desperately our media is failing this country. I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked on trashing the media, but if we're going to talk about the downfall of the empire and the destruction of the United States, the media plays a massive piece of that play. I mean, there's a massive part in that play for CNN and for Fox and for MSNBC and for NBC and all of those douche canoes who work there. So they need to know that they are absolutely on the hook for that, for sure. That's terrible. The media is terrible. Sorry, I don't want to get too sidetracked. But yeah, I just think it all goes back to how it's all really kind of connected. The stuff that we do in other countries, it's going to eventually happen here, and it's going to get worse. And I think that we're seeing that now. I think a lot of it, I have a little bit of hope though, because I think people are now paying really close attention to it. At least the militarization of police, there's a huge call for, at the very least, taking away their toys. But I mean, defunding them. I mean, I didn't know. If you would have told me 5 years ago I was going to start hearing like loud conversations about defunding the police, I would have been like, what? Or like even abolishing the police. There's some, and a lot of it's people that, I know and talk to and have the same political beliefs, but it's like a mainstream conversation now, which I wouldn't have thought possible, 10 years ago or so. So I do have some hope on that for sure. I don't know if you guys do, but yeah, it seems like at least we have some people aware of the problem now that maybe weren't before. So that's a good move, I guess.
I think the increased awareness is good, and that there are more conversations happening is definitely a good development. But I often feel, and Morgan, maybe you can give your assessment of this too, that the totality of power is just too much at this point. The amount of weaponry, the amount of foot soldiers who are willing to be police officers, it's gotten to the point where it's fine to have conversations about defunding and abolition, but when they have the monopoly on violence, how are we going to do any of those progressive things? How are we going to defund them? How are we going to abolish them? They exist for the opposite reason of both of those, and they're going to do anything to hold on to their power. So I don't see a lot of hope. I see in the town I live in, which is right outside of New York, in New Jersey, increased policing on a daily basis. I'll be outside at 3 a.m. having a cigarette, and I'll see 3 or 4 police SUVs go by in that time, and it's absurd. Nothing's happening on the street. Nobody's out. I'm the only one out. Sometimes they'll shine a light in my face. When I lived in Brooklyn, it was 100 times worse, and the people in those communities in Bed-Stuy where I lived have to deal with it every single day. This constant crushing of their dignity and self-worth. So, and I don't see it getting better. I didn't see it getting better there when I lived there several years ago. So I don't have much hope. Morgan, do you?
Well, yes. Yes, I believe that. Okay, so I think about, because obviously I understand what you mean. Like it's scary. They have unprecedented weaponry. They are showing their willingness to use it, and we know that there is more willingness behind that. Behind Trump, and he has his supporters who in terms of like everyday folks, but also in terms of people like Tom Cotton and whatever, who support sending in the 1st Cavalry Division to to crush protests and such, and treat this like a civil war. I don't know. I think about like right out like World War I, and right after there was that explosion of revolutions that really people who had believed that revolution was imminent for decades we're still surprised by it.
Mhm.
Like Rosa Luxemburg, said that, before the revolution, nothing could seem more impossible. But after the day after the revolution, nothing could seem more inevitable. So I think that, we have this perspective. Another example is, a matter of weeks before the February Revolution broke out, Lenin was musing that, like, the really big battles to come will be fought by the next generation.
Mhm.
He didn't see it happening either. And then a number of weeks later, the Tsar was literally overthrown and a kind of provisional government installed. And so there's things boiling beneath the surface, that, like, aren't always readily apparent. And there's definitely a daunting task in front of us, but I wouldn't be a revolutionary communist if I didn't believe that victory was possible. We are many and they are few,
Mhm.
and when it comes down to it, we control production. We really have the ability to strangle this system when it comes down to it. And I don't know what the future holds. Um, I mean, I've read books like The Iron Heel, where a revolution goes wrong and a fascist dictatorship appears, but then the revolution exists, triumphs. Even think about, fascist Italy or Nazi Germany or Japan or wherever, where it seemed like the darkest times. 8 months after the Nazis came to power, the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party of Germany were completely annihilated and were purely underground for many years. 13 years later, half of Germany was a socialist republic. And the Nazis were gone, or really just in power in the West. But there was this enormous transformation. The communists in Italy had to be excluded from power by force at the direction of the U.S. government in 1947 because they were so popular. So this there, even the thing about fascism is, and I think this is kind of a prescient conversation to have right now, is that it is when the gloves come off. Right? All of the illusions about what the police are and what the capitalist state is and whatever are dissolved. It's all naked and barefaced. It's clearly nothing but a gun in your face. And that's really a last resort, for the capitalist class to maintain its power. There's no going back after that, because then all of the lies about bourgeois democracy, all of the lies about consent of the governed and rule of law and all of that go out the window. And you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And so that's really, once they resort to that, that's really a reaction of fear for them, unprecedented fear. Because it's slipping through their fingers, and that's all they have left. And so it's scary, but I believe that in the end we will win.
And I think and you're absolutely right. And I'm so glad you said it the way that you said it, because that's people might have been a little surprised to hear me say that I had hope, because I'm usually very cynical, but I've been trying to, honest to God, trying to like change my way of thinking a little bit, because I'm trying not to be such a downer all the time. But yeah, I've just been trying to think about it differently. And I think that you're right. There's something bubbling underneath the surface, and I can feel it. And I know other people who are engaged in politics and are paying attention. I know that you can feel it. I mean, it's a palpable energy. And you're right. Fascism is absolutely a reaction of fear. And the only reason they're freaking out is because that they know that they can't hold us back much longer. And I think the only thing that I'm the most unsure of or fearful about, I guess, is that it would be cool if, human beings could figure out how to do this and make it stick. So we don't have to keep fighting this fight over and over again. I don't have a lot of hope for that aspect of it. But and I think that the situation we find ourselves in right now in the United States, and the United States impacts every part of the globe. So whatever happens here is going to happen to everybody, and I'm afraid for that aspect of it, because so many people are going to get hurt. Because I think it is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And people, again, there's my cynicism. Sorry to be a downer, but I want people to be prepared for that, because I really do think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And start mutual aid groups, start gardening, start learning how to sew clothes, start whatever you can do just to like kind of make sure you can take care of yourself. I'm not saying you have to go like crazy prepper, build a vault and a panic room and whatever else, but just kind of prepare yourself, because if it gets as bad as I think it's gonna suck really hard. And I just feel, and again, it's gonna hurt a lot of people around the globe, and that's really the hardest aspect for me to think about. But yeah, but I think you're right. I think this is an absolute reaction of fear, and they know that they're losing their power. And I think it's kind of, when they realize they can't use force anymore, they use propaganda. And when the propaganda stops working, they go back to force. And it's kind of a cycle, and it'd be cool if we could break it.
I think that's
using force, though. Look what they did to Fred Hampton. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down, and they will come through your door and kill you. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't fight back. I absolutely advocate for fighting back against police brutality of any kind. But it's going to take more than marches and protests. And I don't know if, I'm not trying to sound like Lenin here, talking about the proletariat and, they're not ready yet for the revolution. But I am coming more and more to believe that an armed struggle against the police, against the government, is the only thing that's going to change this horrendous status quo we live in. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if any of you are ready for that. I don't know anybody who is ready for that. And each time some tinderbox sets off in our culture, in our society, there are the protests, there are the outrages, there are the Twitter rants, and then it's back to more of the same, well, except more of the same is worse this time around. So I'm not saying let's go bomb a police station or shoot police officers, but they are always going to resort to violence and their weaponry. And I don't see how nonviolence can defeat that.
I think you're right, Jesse, that there is, because what you're getting at is really the inadequacy of like defund the police, reform the police, or whatever. Because when you reform something, what you're doing is you're making it do its job better. And the job of the police is to repress us. The job of the police is to be violent. So they're already doing that job. We don't want them to do that job better. We want them to stop repressing us. So if it comes down to force against force, you mentioned Lenin. Lenin said that a revolution happens when the rulers can no longer go on ruling in the old way, and the ruled can no longer go on being ruled in the old way. I think that a lot of what has happened in the last 4 months or so has really been the way it struck me when it first broke out was people were talking about like, I can't wait for it to go back to normal. I can't wait for COVID to end. And that was what all everyone's focus was on. And they were really kind of looking to the police, to maintain, that order, keep people at home and whatever and all of that. And then we didn't have an incident like this for a little bit. And then this happened. And it was kind of a wake-up call that, like, this is what going back to normal looks like. This is what normal used to be before COVID. And, millions of people stood up and said, we can't take that anymore. We can't do that anymore. And so when you look at like the arc of police militarization was really a question for them of not being able to rule in the old way anymore either. You know, they had their illusions, because the thing is that police militarization, and I talk about this in my article, police militarization is really just one part of a larger program that includes the growth of mass incarceration, that includes the war on drugs and all the things that that did to Black and brown communities in the U.S. and around the globe. And so those are all systems of social control in various ways. The mass incarceration system is a way to deal with the fact that capitalism cannot produce enough jobs to employ everybody anymore. So they create this class of permanently unemployed or unemployable people, and putting them in jails is the easiest, or the carceral system in some way is the easiest way to control millions of unemployed people who would otherwise be on the streets tearing shit up, demanding money for bread. So that's a big part of that social control. And so you have the militarized police because they're like, well, we need to be able to meet any possible threat. You know, it's the drug dealers, the drug lords are outgunning us and whatever. But it's also at the same time, the police departments are getting money because they're being told that, like, kind of this revived culture of poverty philosophy that said that, like, Black communities are to blame for their own poverty because of this, like, culture that's in them or whatever. And that's really that same kind of philosophy that says that a criminal is born or once created cannot be changed. The only thing you can do is lock them up, get them off the streets. You know, that's what drives that mass incarceration system. And that's something that, you know, that has been, again, a bipartisan agreement for the last 40 years. Whoever you want to talk about, you know, name a character who's been in politics that long, and I'll show you their support for a crime bill, their support for a mass jail expansion project, their support for privatizing prisons, their support for, you know, extending the terms of criminals, of keeping people incarcerated longer, of any number of things. Fosta Sesta, you know, criminalizing sex workers in new ways, to again just keep and expand this sector of society that is you permanently have a policeman looking over your shoulder. I mean, we're looking at 6 or 7 million people in the totality of the carceral system right now who are being watched by the state every single day, and that is an attempt at social control because of robotics, because of new methods of improving the efficiency of machines. That is an effort to chase the rapidly declining rate of profit. And so that's been sliding downhill since the 50s. Has really been that trajectory, accelerating since the oil shock. So that's been coming to a head too. And so you have a situation now where you have people who cannot rule in the old way anymore and are ruling in this kind of more of a gloves coming off kind of way, and you have the people who've been subjected to that for the last 50 or 60 years, saying we can't handle this anymore either. And you know, the real strength of the movement now, I think, is the fact that it's not just Black people standing up. It's trans people standing up. It's gay people standing up. It's women. It's white people going out there. It's working class people saying, you know, we can't bear to see this happen anymore, or this happens to us too, or like, this is not, you know, we realize that we're the next ones on the menu, you know, or whatever, and kind of coalescing into this enormous movement that is rising up. So I mean, that's kind of why I'm optimistic about this. You know, it's scary, like I said, no doubt, you know, but what we've seen is the day after the violence in Lafayette Park, when they cleansed the park of protesters and tear gassed people and shot people and whatever, the next day there was several thousand people who marched down there in defiance of the curfew. They chanted "fuck your curfew" at 7 o'clock when they were supposed to be evicted from the streets by the MPD and the National Guard. They chanted "fuck your curfew" and stood out there, thousands of them, in defiance. You know, the same thing happened in Kenosha the day after after Rittenhouse shot those protesters. They didn't stop the protest. They didn't send people home that night. People stayed. They came out the next day in even greater numbers, and that tells me something. You know, people are not being intimidated anymore, and so, you know, I think I think that is really what is kind of pushing this forward, is that so many people, whether you're a student with racked up in student debt who sees no way out for the rest of their entire lives, whether you are a trans person who sees every aspect of their last civil rights victories for the last 30 years, every belief that the system can be reformed in your favor being destroyed in front of you in an instant and nobody lifting a finger to save it. It's women who see, this viciously sexist, misogynist system. Abortion is on the rocks, and Trump is not being questioned, in so many ways. Them facing that too. There's a crisis of housework in this country and such too. And on the forefront of that is domestic workers, so who are facing the same kind of thing. Again, driven by declining wages, driven by declining rates of profit. It's all kind of coming to a head where people really won't have a choice except to be out in the streets anymore, because the choice is be in the streets or die.
And I think that's why we're seeing like the kind of a more desperate attempt to divide people too. I mean, they're trying. I tweeted about it the other day, and I got a lot of the whole, oh, you're a class reductionist, but I said they want it to be a race war. That's what they're going to. I mean, they're trying to push it that way now, I think. Because if it's a race war, they avoid the class war, and that's not saying that racism isn't a problem and that it needs to be dealt with, but it's what they use to manipulate us that we need to pay attention to, and people need to stop getting in their heads about it, and you have to examine your enemy, and that's what they do. They try to divide us up because they know that if we figure out that we all have more in common than we have, differences, then it's over for them. Like, that's it. They have to keep us as divided as possible, and there's going to be increased desperation in their attempts to make that happen. And I just wish that people could see through that when it's happening. Because, the black guy down the street is not your enemy. The Mexican guy who, lives the next town over, and he's not your enemy. And, we are not each other's enemies. Our enemies wear suits, and they walk the halls of Congress, and they run corporations, and they own yachts, and they don't give two shits about any one of us or any one of our individual issues, or I honestly don't think that a single one of them cares about gay rights or abortion or any of those things. They don't care. Those are tools used to keep people divided, while they I always say, in matters of war and Wall Street, we have one party. Everything else is used as a distraction to keep us divided. And that's the reality of it. People need to wake up to that, because the things being used against us could easily be avoided if we were just smarter about it. I think. That's just my humble opinion.
I mean, I don't think that it's class reductionist to say that the basis of unity is class solidarity, because class is what we have in common. Right? And that's not to reduce race or gender or anything else. It's to say that class kind of overlays all of those things, right? You have working class black people, you have ruling class black people. That doesn't mean that white supremacy doesn't still exist. Doesn't mean that it's not still, but it's a part of the same system, because, a higher percentage of black people are working class than are white people. A higher percentage of gay and trans people are working class than are than they are of middle or ruling class. Same thing with women. Women are in a much higher rates of poverty than men are by comparison. Doesn't mean that there aren't men in poverty. Doesn't mean that there aren't women in the ruling class. But class becomes this overlaying factor that becomes the basis of solidarity for all of us, because we can all point to this and say we're all workers. That's the basis of solidarity with migrants. That's the basis of solidarity with refugees. That's the basis of solidarity between races and ethnicities and genders and sexualities and everybody. Is when it comes down to it, we are all used as profit generating machines to benefit a ruling class that contributes nothing to society.
Well said. Well said. So, kind of bringing it back to
we have been all over the place a little bit. It's all right. I like it. I prefer this rather than structure.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah.
But bringing it back to militarized policing, and something we mentioned toward the beginning of the show. Can you talk about the exchange program that a lot of U.S. police departments have with Israel?
Yeah. So the you have a lot of these like pro-Zionist groups, or well, they're Zionist groups is what they are. But like a lot of lobbyist groups like AIPAC and JINSA and the Anti-Defamation League and so on, who really kind of make it their business to defend a pro-Israeli point of view in the U.S. Congress and in society, U.S. society, have really, and this has been especially after 2001. You'll remember Israel right after the 9/11 attacks kind of came out and tried to be like, guys, we're the foremost, specialists in fighting Muslim terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
So like, come learn from us and how to deal with this. And that was a huge PR victory for Zionist groups like that, because that was the basis on which these police exchange programs began, where they were sending U.S. police to Israel to learn from Israeli police. They and not just like beat cops, but like, what's that?
The Second Intifada was happening around that time as well.
Yes. Second Intifada really kind of began in 2000. So it happened. It's actually a good point. Happened in this context of a new militant uprising by the Palestinians. And so you have Israeli, and it's not just Israeli, like, beat cops or whatever. It's the Assam, the paramilitarized border police, who are just, wildly racist and brutal to Palestinians at the slightest. Like, they bring them in as like riot control cops, but they're border police. And, the thing is, it's like BORTAC, right? The Trump sent BORTAC, Customs and Border Protection units to Portland, right? And we were like, that's some heinous shit, because this is like, they're like next level militarization. Israel's been doing that for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the Assam is BORTAC being sent, into Palestinian communities to just beat the hell out of people with no consequence, to shoot them, to do whatever they want to do to them, blow up their houses, burn down their olive groves, and they have impunity to do it, basically. So these are the people, and U.S. cops are not just meeting with them; they're meeting with the Shin Bet too, the Israeli intelligence. So they're learning from this, and what are they learning? They're learning that that every criminal is a potential terrorist, right? They use this phrase "crimi-terror," to describe it. And so they inculcate in U.S. cops this attitude, the attitude of the occupier, that every person that you meet is a potential terrorist, and you have to react in this way. And so, like, I live in Washington, D.C., and our police chief, Peter Newsham, is somebody, he has defended Metro Police going to Israel for this, saying, well, we need, there's nobody better to learn counterterrorism tactics from and stuff. But that's the thing, is who do they consider to be a terrorist? They consider everybody they police to be a terrorist. Mm-hmm. So then they bring that back here, and you wind up with situations like we had this past week, where this kid, Dion K, who's been 18 for 3 whole weeks, is shot within 5 seconds of this cop running out of his police car, because this cop decided that because this kid probably had a gun, he was therefore, basically dead man walking. And so they learned that from the Israeli police, mm-hmm. right? You talked earlier at the beginning of this program about how the Minneapolis police, I think you said like what's like 1 in 8 or some wild number of Minneapolis police officers have trained in Israel, or Israel also sends police here to hold seminars that then thousands of police officers can go to. So they're bringing it here as well to do that. And yeah, and I actually show this in my story, an example of them using the same neck hold that killed George Floyd, of Israeli police using that on Palestinians. It's that they learn the one from the other. And what's interesting is actually that Israel has been doing this all across the continent. In Honduras, for example, in that government's drive to privatize everything and kind of bring it in line with like Western police state philosophy, they've been bringing in Israeli border police to train their police units. So it's, it happens in a lot of places that Israel is kind of exporting their occupation tactics. And when I think about like the right-wing governments in Honduras or in El Salvador or Colombia or whatever, like these are kind of the same kind of thing in terms of the U.S. has helped these governments to come to power. In El Salvador, basically making it impossible for the FMLN to govern and ensuring that that they failed and that the right wingers wound up in power. And now going about setting up a garrison state of sorts to make sure that left-wing movements, whether it's the FARC or the FMLN or whoever have you, do not have a chance to come to power. And that's why the U.S. exports so much arms to Colombia, for example, but is also making deals with Central America. Like Trump's answer to like solving, quote unquote, the migrant crisis has been to give money to these right-wing governments, basically to enhance their own policing, to make sure that these people can't even escape their own borders. Mm-hmm. That's been their answer, has been enhance the policing abroad, in that way to contain the problem there. Which, I mean, the situation in Honduras right now is so bad that I think like 1/10 of the population is expected to try and flee the country in the next year. And that's a situation the U.S. has created there by systematically destroying any attempt to do anything better there to make sure that, maquiladores and such remain in operation, which gets back into, as we were talking about before, the capitalism. So
thanks, Bill Clinton.
Right. We got off track again. We were talking about police militarization. Israel. Okay, so because
it's the best episode ever. I'm not even kidding. I love it so much.
Israel is a laboratory for occupation, for occupation tactics, and they export that. They were used to train the police, those police units I told you about in Iraq after the U.S. disbanded the Iraqi police. They're used all over the place for this kind of thing, and really, U.S. empire at large, and Israel is a part of the U.S. empire, is a laboratory for militarized policing. So you can look at like I said, name the tactic, name the weapon. It was probably pioneered in some occupation situation first. Rubber bullets in Northern Ireland. CS gas was developed as a low-grade chemical weapon to be used. It's actually banned in warfare because it's seen as an inherently escalatory weapon that could lead to more serious things. But civilians, I guess, they don't expect to respond with sarin, artillery shells. So it's okay for them to use it against us. But it is a chemical weapon. Make no doubt about that. So yeah, that's really kind of the deal with U.S. cops going to train in Israel, or being trained by Israeli cops, I should say, because like I said, it happens in the U.S. too. They come here and hold these huge seminars.
Kind of what has been so genius in like the evil psychopath kind of way about the war on terror. It's kind of like the war on drugs. There's no like, you can't see the enemy. It doesn't right. You can't touch.
You defeat drugs.
Right. And terrorism is such like they can call anybody a terrorist. I mean, in this country, they can call you a terrorist and haul you off, and you can't do anything about that. So it's like this just very broad and ridiculous kind of war on nothingness. And so it's never ending. It doesn't ever have to end. And so that's kind of what is, if you're an evil psychopath, that's genius. I think that the war on drugs taught them a lot about this type of warfare. And they learned that that drugs wasn't a good target. They probably should have learned that from Prohibition, but they didn't, and they went after drugs. That didn't work out either. But terrorism is like a big scary thing that it means something different to every person who hears the word. And so they don't have to define it. They can just use the big scary word and people will be like, okay, yeah, we need to fight that, you know? So that's kind of the wicked genius behind all of this, because then it's a never ending war and you know, they can make shit tons of money off of it. And the people, the more that you were talking about there not being jobs, and that's how they get military. That's how they get people to enlist in the military.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, there's no jobs, and you need an education, and you need healthcare. And those are the three. If you ask people, why did you join the military? Those are the top three reasons. I needed a job, I needed healthcare, or I needed an education. And so they're kind of like, you know, sheep herding these kids into literally working for a terrorist organization, but thinking that they're fighting terrorism. It's a really kind of a crazy mindfuck when you really think about it that way.
Have you guys seen that video? I think it was going around Twitter a couple of weeks ago, where I think it was actually a TikTok video where like the guy was like asking like, why did you join the army? Why did you join the army? And the guy's like, you know, the guy's like, well, I was promised an enlistment bonus of $20,000 or whatever, you know, that I didn't see. Another guy's like, I wanted a Camaro, you know. So, yeah, I mean, it's
18-year-old kids. I mean, if you're 17 or 18 years old and there's no jobs and you can't afford to go to college because your parents don't have jobs or they have shitty jobs or whatever, and you don't have health care and it's expensive, and what else are you going to do? I mean, you don't have a lot of options. And so the military.
Yeah. I grew up in a country town where there was a small naval air station. And if you didn't work there or in the military, then you were either a waterman or a tobacco farmer, or some kind of like no dead end like service industry job, which is the first 10 years of my adult life were working as a line cook there, you know. So, and I know many people who tried to join the military or did join the military just to get the hell out of there, you know, because they had they had a high school diploma or whatever, but like, what realistically are you going to do if you don't have, you know, a plan? And, you know, I mean, most people, even myself included, had fairly limited imaginations when they were 17, 18 and lived in the middle of bumfuck nowhere their entire lives. You know, the people who have money, the people who have respect in the community, who is it? It's the Marines that walk around town. You know, it's the naval officers that you see, you know. So, it kind of, you know, it gets you out of town, and it gets you money that you know might not be able to get otherwise. And I think that's kind of what hooks people into it at first. No doubt there are some people who join it because they want to go have, you know, commit legalized murder or whatever. There are people who do that, no doubt. There are people who join it for patriotic reasons or whatever. Those people definitely exist who believe in what they're doing, but I don't.
Kyle joined so he could murder people, or say he murdered hundreds of people. He was the subject.
The guy that lied.
Propaganda film.
Which still makes me like shiver a little bit when it's like he was thought of as a hero because he killed a lot of people. Like, that's really kind of fucked up, and I don't know what that says about people who think that way, but it's. When I hear he had like 103 kills, I think, wow, you are a shit stain of a human being. Not, oh my gosh, what a hero, you know?
That's not confirmed, though.
Right.
That's what he says in his book. He also says in his book that he climbed up to the top of the Superdome in New Orleans during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and picked off looters with his sniper rifle.
Oh, yeah, I remember him saying that. Yeah.
Max Blumenthal.
Yeah, what a hero.
Max Blumenthal did a really good deep dive into Chris Kyle's.
I don't think I've read that. I need to go look that up. I'm gonna write that down.
I believe it's on YouTube. There might also be an accompanying piece that Max wrote, but it's worth looking at because he destroys that whole narrative that Clint Eastwood presents about this supposedly heroic man.
Mass murderer.
And
Sorry.
I remember going to see that in the theater. Don't ask me why I went and paid for it, but I wanted to see it because I knew it was. I wanted to see it when it came out because I knew it was going to be a propaganda piece. And in the opening scene, he kills a child, I believe, and it's presented as this moral crisis for him, but he's a hero for doing it. And I remember looking around the theater to see if anybody else was like, what the fuck is this bullshit? And everybody just accepted it. Nobody even let out a moan when this child was shot by this American sniper. And it really spoke to me, at least. It spoke to how embedded in our social psyche, our social conscience, violence is, both domestically and internationally, and it was very disturbing.
I think another piece of that too is how ingrained the respect the troops is. Mm-hmm. And so if it's an American soldier that did it, it must be good, you know? And I think that that's kind of part of the underlying psyche that goes behind that too, because I think that you are thoroughly propagandized from birth that if somebody's in a uniform, they're good, you should respect them, you should salute them, buy their dinner, whatever. So I think that that's another aspect of that people, if it's an American soldier, it must be good. And I think that's actually a lot of the reason why people have a hard time with like the collateral murder video and stuff like that. Because surely if an American soldier does it, it must be acceptable. They had no other choice, and you're mean and you hate America if you say that that's a bad thing. And that's another part of, the brainwashing that we're going to have to deprogram in people, a lot of people.
That's kind of what I was saying about like the nuclear bombs and stuff, like where they'll acknowledge that something is bad if they can explain it away as like unnecessary, mm-hmm. Evil or whatever. And because then it's like, well, then was it really evil?
Right.
So that's just a part of them rewriting history.
But when it comes to the collateral murder video, when it comes to the video of George Floyd being murdered, there's no equivocation there. It's unequivocally murder.
Yeah.
And you can listen to the helicopter pilots on the collateral murder video, and there's total bloodlust in their voices. They want nothing more than to...
Come on, light them up.
These people.
Right, he's like, taunts him, come out so I can shoot you. Yeah.
Yeah, just pick up a weapon.
Pick up a weapon. All you got to do is touch a weapon.
Yeah.
And there were children in that van. There were children in that van. Those were journalists.
Right.
So,
Two Reuters journalists.
Yeah.
Then you see the George Floyd video when Derek Chauvin, I believe the officer's name is, correct? The murderer.
I think so.
He looks up and he has total bloodlust in his eyes, and it just seems like an imported continuum from what happened in Iraq with the collateral murder video, which came out in 2010, but I believe that attack was in 2007.
Yeah, that's right.
You see the bloodlust there translated into bloodlust here within the police, and it's again why I have, maybe I'll revise it and say I do have hope, but there's so much violence embedded in the police institution at this point that reform or defunding, anything short of abolition, doesn't...
Reform is a joke. People need to stop. People need to stop with reform. Reforming anything, the Democratic Party, the police system, none of that shit's gonna work. We're past that. It's too far gone. We are too far gone for that. Reforming the policing structure in this country would be just a ridiculous waste of time and effort. It would just be, it's not going to work. You can't, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, this shit goes back to, the slave patrols. This is ingrained in the kind of the institutional psyche of policing in this country. And there's no reforming that. You can't reform it. You can't just separate the two. They're fully entrenched. So it's going to take complete abolition and start from scratch if you even need to. But you can't reform this shit. It's too far gone, way too far gone.
I agree.
So moved. And
there was a point I was going to make, but I forgot it.
Sorry, I probably interrupted you.
Yeah, it had to do with what you were just saying.
Oh.
But anyway, another question I wanted to ask Morgan about Israel is, you mentioned how they often test their weapons on Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
They use those illegally occupied territories as labs, essentially, to see how new weaponry works. Have you found that American police forces are doing the same, acquiring new weapons that have technology they're not really familiar with, but this weapon's supposed to do this, so we're going to try it out in this crowd control situation?
I think they're eager to use tools that they have had for a long time. Things like stinger grenades, for example. I mean, they know how a tear gas canister works, but the so-called baton rounds or whatever, like how many times do you get a chance to use? I mean, these guys fucking love it. You know what I mean? Yeah. I've been on the front lines of many of these protests and had baton rounds shot at me and the little pepper paintballs, and stuff. They fucking love it. They just cannot wait to use them on people because, like I was saying, it's state-sanctioned violence. They watch them. It's all glorified, and it's not just it's glorified in their culture. I was talking about this the other day in D.C. A couple of years ago. The MPD was busted with these T-shirts that glorified jump outs, which, if you're not familiar with them, they're like the ugly older brother of stop and frisk. Mm-hmm. And it's literally unmarked cop vans and plainclothes police officers just pull up and hop out and just pull out guns and decide to search people. It's monstrous.
I had that I had that happen to me, minus the guns, in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, and I know for a fact that it was only because I was sitting on the stoop of my apartment with two friends of mine, friends I'd made after I moved to the neighborhood, who lived on the same block, who are black. I know that's the only reason they pulled up in this unmarked car, and they hopped out, and they had bulletproof vests on. They were ready to go. They looked like mercenaries. They looked like Blackwater dudes.
Yeah.
And
they had a flag that had a skull and crossbones on it that said "Vest up, one in the chamber." It's a culture that glorifies violence. I've seen shirts from other police forces that say "We get up early to beat the crowd." Play on words. But it's an image of a guy holding a police baton or something. You know what I mean? They love this shit.
Yeah.
They join it. Everybody jokes about the guy who was bullied in high school became a cop or whatever, because it is violence. It is glorified violence. It is sanctioned violence. And especially now, they know that they can get away with it. They know that a certain section of the media, of the government, of the population will excuse anything they do. And that those elements will only turn on them when it becomes politically inconvenient to keep defending them, not because it's actually something that they disapprove of. So, it is I almost want to call it a cult of violence in a way. it is really just at the very core of what the police are. It gets back to what I was saying before, that the threat of violence is itself violence, and the police are always threatening violence against certain groups of the population, especially in Black and brown communities, against trans people are another people. Many police, the NYPD, the DC Metro PD are groups that are both known to profile trans women as sex workers. NYPD has said they drive down the street looking for tall women with Adam's apples to pull them over, or to pull over and search them. And if they find loose cash or a condom on your person, they book you for solicitation. It's the same kind of thing. It's a permanent culture of fear that they are aiming to inculcate in people. And things like jump outs, things like stop and frisk, these are aimed at just engendering a feeling of fear, a feeling of always being controlled, and a fear of just that permanent feeling of like you can never be at ease in public. Like, think about like the ease that people enjoy in public, and they say, well, I don't understand, why they couldn't comply. I don't understand why, this or that, why they got to be that way. Imagine if you could never be in public and be at ease, just the way that wears on you.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think that people talk about complying. Listen, if I were a Black man in this country, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you handle that anyway, but I don't know if you comply. I mean, I've seen videos where they comply and they get killed anyway. So are you better to run, or do you try to stay and comply? You're kind of fucked either way. So the people who say, why can't they just comply? That's bullshit. Quit victim blaming. You don't know what you would do in that situation, and they're fucked either way. I mean, if they run, they're going to get, at the very least chased and tackled, and then probably beat up, probably shot. But if they comply, we have numerous examples on video of them getting killed any damn way. So people need to stop saying, why can't they just comply? That's
and then in jails and stuff too. Yeah. I mean, how many people die in Rikers every year? Yeah. I mean, that place is a concentration camp.
Mm-hmm.
And many city police's jails, Cook County Jail, in Chicago, is the same way. Many cities have the same issue. I mean, it's like you said.
If you look at the Khalif Browder case, it's a crime against humanity, and then you have to realize that it's not isolated to just his case. That's happening millions of times over, especially since there's essentially no habeas corpus in this country anymore. And again, it goes back to what Morgan.
Slavery didn't end in this country. They just repackaged it. I mean, there was the judge that got busted for literally selling kids, literally selling children into the criminal justice system to fill jails, because that's the private prison system. That's how they make their money. The more bodies, the more money. And there was a judge that got busted for literal slavery, selling brown and Black kids into the criminal justice system. 13, 14-year-olds. Like, it's a completely broken and disgusting system. I mean, it's horrifying.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And so we're just over 2 hours now, so we should wrap it up. It's been
Thank you for being so generous with your time. Like, we like to talk and like go, like we like to know everything, so we do this every time.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Like, it's Labor Day,
Right.
Yeah.
Hang out and talk about shit.
Not that you can do much in the whole world of Corona, but you can still go have some. Yeah.
So, as we wrap up, Morgan, what are you currently working on?
Well,
anything with regard to police?
No.
Okay.
Nothing to do with police. I would say the things that I've been writing about recently have been about, like, one, the Space Force and stuff going on with that, because we've gotten some documents recently articulating that that service branches philosophy and kind of how they understand why they have to exist and how that plays into again, like we were talking about, like international competition, so-called great power competition, with Russia and China and other things too. So I've been writing about that a lot lately. I have a piece that came out recently that goes through a lot of the justifications the U.S. has used about claims that Russia and China are militarizing space and showing how the U.S. actually did that several decades ago. Item by item, anti-satellite missiles, particle beams in space, stalker satellites, et cetera, and more. So that's one thing I've been looking at. Another thing I've been following is the situation in the South China Sea, and the daily proliferation of U.S. spy plane flights across the South China Sea, signals intelligence planes, and so on, submarine hunters and naval patrol aircraft and stuff, multiple times a day, flying a couple dozen miles from Guangdong coast, and so on, every single day, zigzagging back and forth. As well as on the Chinese side, they're developing their naval strike capabilities and beefing up their stuff there. The U.S. is holding naval drills and selling Taiwan weapons, moving to sell Indonesia weapons and other stuff too. And the context of all of that is the fact that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has now begun, again, a dialogue to come up with China, which is not a member of ASEAN, to come up with a code of conduct for the South China Sea that will settle a lot of these long-standing disputes that would make the U.S. presence there unnecessary. So naturally, the U.S. is trying to sabotage that, implement its own code of conduct that it would be extremely anti-China and very, playing into their military posturing. So I've been looking at that as well. But yeah.
Can you tell everybody where they can? Where's the best place to find your work? As you post it. I know you write for Sputnik, but can they follow your Twitter? Do you post it on there once it's up?
Yeah. No matter where most of my work is on Sputnik, but I write for a couple of other publications too. So you could find all of that on my Twitter account, which is at lavender and red, letter N, and the colors lavender and red. So that's me. Or you can just look for me, Morgan Artyukhina, and it'll pop up. So
great,
cool.
We'll put that information in the show notes and link to your pieces as well. Morgan, thank you very much for joining us. It's Labor Day. It was a great conversation, I think. So our guest today has been Morgan Artyukhina, and they are a journalist for Sputnik, Mint Press, I believe you write for as well, and other outlets. And we will link to Morgan's pieces in our show notes. And I've been Jesse Zerwell with my co-host Misty Winston, and this has been episode 17 of Facts on the Ground. Thank you, everybody, for watching.